Hi everyone, is everyone back? Ooh, that sounds louder than it.
Yeah, it's good.
Up?
No, good.
Okay, good. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Delia Hanna, and you might recognize my name from the emails. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for 21st Century Studies here, and a philosopher by training, actually, at Columbia, so it's across the way. So welcome, and thank you all so much for coming. It's a real pleasure and thrilled to finally have this conference happening. So I am very excited to introduce Natalie Jeremijenko, our next speaker, an artist whose work has inspired me for a long time. Natalie is a professor of visual art in New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, where she directs the X Design Environmental Health Clinic, about which I believe we're going to hear today. And the red X will be the signifier of that, among many other projects, which I'm looking forward to hearing about. Natalie's an extraordinary polymath, holding degrees in fine arts, neuroscience, biochemistry, my field in history and philosophy of science, as well as a PhD in computer science and engineering from the University of Queensland. She's taught at the intersection of the visual arts and engineering at Yale, University of California, San Diego, San Francisco Art Institute, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, probably many other places that I'm leaving out, as well as exhibited, or in many cases performed her work worldwide. And it's the locations where her work appears that are sometimes particularly interesting. Of course, in museums, such as New York's Museum of Modern Art, but also on web platforms, at rock music festivals, and in far less glamorous locations like urban parks, highways, and heavily polluted riverbeds. So I'd like to mention just a few of her many works that have been particularly interesting for me, both in my teaching and in my own research. So I've made use of projects like How Stuff is Made, which is online, a repository of information about how quantities are made, the material practices involved, environmental implications of those objects, as well as labor conditions, something that this is a piece of work that I found very useful, for example, in teaching marks on the commodity form, or a piece called Feral Robotic Dogs, which I use to encourage engineering students to take their ingenuity and their technical expertise out into the field and work creatively to do things like sniff out toxins in a playful way in a waste site or an urban park. But it was one work in particular that I saw in 2001, quite a long time ago, called Tree Logic, which is a collection of 6 trees that are planted in metal containers and hung upside down. This is at MassMoCA, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in North Adams, Massachusetts. I saw this work and it simply stuck in my mind for quite a long time. At the time I was just finishing my undergraduate degree in philosophy and chemistry. And something about this piece struck me as exemplifying something I didn't know what, but that I wanted to be able to articulate philosophically. And in fact, it ended up being a big part of my PhD thesis in philosophy of art and philosophy of science. So I have to say very personally, thank you for inspiring my own research in that area. And so I'd like to then contextualize the importance of Natalie's work for our discourse of Anthropocene feminism, our efforts to articulate what Anthropocene feminism might be. So this morning I decided to warm up for this conference by listening to a lecture that Donna Haraway gave recently at the University of Alberta, in which she argued that the Anthropocene ought rather be called the capitalist scene, insofar as it is the imperative of capital to reproduce itself that above all drives the extraction and use of fossil fuels, and therefore figures as the geological force, if there is one, rather than the fictitious unit that might be identified as anthropos. An audience member, after her talk, posed a question, which I'll paraphrase. He had just come from a meeting of the university's new and generously funded Leadership Institute. If things go the most predictable way, he said, the Institute will create some worthy leaders for the capitalist scene, people who create fossils as quickly as possible. But, he continued, if through some freak of corporate recruiting, you were given that $35 million and the task of cultivating different sensibilities. What experiences would you want those students to have to break them out of the modes of thought that are central to the capitalist scene? And Haraway reminded us, of course, that we didn't need $35 million to break out of the thought. We could do it on a much lower budget. But I would suggest, and actually she made reference to a number of art projects in her talk as central to that reorientation. But I would have answered that among the experiences we need to have to reorient our relationship to the Anthropocene, or better, the capitalist scene, would certainly, and also to the sort of more small and local disasters of environmental, multi-species, and personal human health that may not figure on a geological scale but are certainly important. But among those, we would certainly want to have some experiences of Natalie's work, her recipes for socio-environmental practice, and above all, her humor and seemingly exhilarating and boundless energy for diving into the wreck, a phrase that Richard reminded us of this morning. And finally, I'd like to highlight just one respect in which Natalie's work is exemplary for thinking about Anthropocene feminism, apart from the capitalist scene. Namely, her radical departure from any sort of aesthetic or political yearning after a restoration of any kind of mythical nature. And her insistence on entangling ourselves more deeply and imbricating ourselves critically within the very technological and economic conditions, the organisms and the environments that are both the causes and the symptoms of the Anthropocene. Feed nutritious and detoxifying food to fish. Kiss frogs with antifungal lip balm. Build bridges through urban space for butterflies. Cultivate wetlands with the explicit purpose of using them to remediate oil spills. Eat or milk critters that are ecologically important, and burn junk mail on urban farms, just to make reference to a few projects, some of which we might hear about today. Or use the 14th Amendment to grant corporate personhood to trees and allow them to invest in themselves, as we are encouraged to do. In short, intervene, intervene, intervene. So if someone like Francis Bacon was the experimentalist of the Anthropocene, both a forefather, and I use the term quite in a gendered way intentionally, of the Anthropocene and some of its rather unfortunate outcomes. I love the idea that Natalie, in her fusion of art, science, and technology and engineering, might be the paradigmatic experimentalist of Anthropocene feminism. So, with that, thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. That's a great introduction. I thought I would introduce and try and duck the expectations of that a little by asking a few questions or preloading a few questions like why child labor might be in your future, or which is my snail and how does it email me. But actually what I wanted to claim is that contemporary conceptual art practices might have something, well, the 20th century contemporary conceptual art practices might have something to offer. One thing to offer, not much, but one thing. I think that there's a tradition of institutional critique that you're probably familiar with that I think is an idea worth retrieving and holding on to, and which of course you would be familiar with as artists rearranging museums and rethinking who and what is left out of museums and how culture is historicized and whose stories get told, but I think can be generalized to other institutions. And that's what I'd like to introduce you to today. I'm going to show you a slew of projects to populate and animate the methodology of socio-ecological systems design or experimenting, lifestyle experiments, public experiments. But really I want you to see them in the context of different institutional frameworks. The first I'll introduce you to is the Environmental Health Clinic, which is how I frame my practice at NYU. I set up my lab at NYU as a health clinic, an environmental health clinic. So it works like a health clinic that you'd be familiar with at a university. People who come to the clinic come with environmental health concerns as opposed to medical health concerns, and they walk out with prescriptions not for pharmaceuticals, but for things they can do to actually improve local environmental health, air quality, food systems, water quality. People who come to the clinic are called inpatients rather than patients, because they're too impatient to wait for legislative change. And really what I'm trying to do is redefine health, not as external and not as internal and pharmaceutical and medicalized and atomized, but health as external in the air quality in this room, in the food systems we depend on, in the shared environmental health. And that's the institutional twist that you'll see here. So yes, just to state again, to redefine health issues as environmental issues and environmental issues as health issues is really to address what I call the crisis of agency, which is the much more insidious crisis than the climate crisis, in that, simply the question what to do as an individual, institutionally, and collectively. And so the environmental health clinic really makes a space to co-produce, to address, to institutionalize that we can and will do something. The other institutional context I want to introduce you to is the ooze, the Bronx ooze. Of course, ooze is zoo backwards, but without cages. And it's specifically about creating habitat for non-humans in the urban context and to facilitate convivial and productive interaction between humans and non-humans. And of course, I don't need to remind you how desperately we need to update our zoological gardens and the incarceration of animals in these little categorical boxes. And I'll have you know that something that shocks me still, I don't know if I believe it, the American Zoological and Aquarium Association claims that more people visit zoos and aquariums every year than all professional sports combined. So they are a major institutional force. And then the final institutional framework is the pharmacy. The charge of the pharmacy, with the deliberate misspelling, is to explore food and food systems that not only reduce the food miles, reduce the pesticide use, reduce the petrochemical fertilizers, all the good things that the food movement is involved with doing, but really is about exploring food and food systems that increase biodiversity, that improve shared environmental health, that increase soil biodiversity and air quality and water quality. So anyway, I think it's just changing the setting the bar a little differently. So I'll start with introducing this. This is one of the projects of the pharmacy is this very simple ag bag, which is an introduction to closed system agriculture. You can see here it's just a bag that hangs on any railing or parapet or double hung window and turns thin air into arable territory. Right? It's made of Tyvek, which you'd be familiar with from your FedEx envelope. The tensile strength also has these micropores in it. So it's waterproof, but it breathes. That means the oxygenated soil growing, that rhizomes there is populated by roots is all around the bag, not just that inch or two at the top. And so we get very effective use of root space to create viable urban vertical agricultural space. So it's closed system. I'll come back to that. I mean, people who see it say, well, how does it drain? Well, it doesn't drain. It has micro reservoirs in it that is polyacrylamide gel, like you have in your diapers. In your contact lenses, it expands to about 400 times its size and then re-releases the moisture back to the soil when the osmotic pressure is sufficient. So it's a closed system, right? There's no runoff. Even with organic farming practices, you have runoff, you lose nutrients. So this is about exploring and demonstrating the viability of closed system agriculture. And of course, the big critique of urban agriculture is why? Why, Some estimates are 1,000 times more expensive to grow the same things in an urban context than in a rural context. And particularly in Manhattan, where I'm based, the hipsters in Brooklyn are growing exactly the same things as the struggling family farmers 7 miles up the Hudson, who don't have, in Rockland County, right? And they don't have the preferential access to chefs. They don't have the hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of free volunteers, right? They have to pay immigrant farm workers, right? So it's, I would say that in urban agriculture we really have to strike a non-compete agreement. And that means, what do you grow in an urban context then? And the answer I would suggest is high nutrition value, high commercial value, highly perishable, non-distributable goods, right? Flowers, in other words. So the pharmacy project's been growing and fostering flowers, which we can get beyond a flower and cupcake and sprinkled on a salad to really explore what flowers are for humans, because they are, of course, the most nutrient-dense food we know of. They're high-colour signals that, powerful antioxidants, the lycopenes. Of course, the urban body needs that with assaulted with all the urban contaminants. So this is the ag bags deployed in various places and around New York City, where really the fundamental claim is to look at how to explore this technology. The only technology that we know that demonstrably, measurably improves air quality is, of course, leaf area, or leaf area index. And so this is a project where we can, in this facade here, we could have, if the building department didn't force me to take it down and then take me to court, we could have grown 76 trees worth of foliage there on a small facade. Using leaf area index to improve urban air quality is something that's radically inexpensive technology. But of course then using these high shoot to root ratio plants, but those that are infloresced and flowering, means that we're addressing the pollinator crisis, which you're all aware of. This is a Photoshop. This is the project that I'm currently working on in London, and I have permission to put these on here. We're just figuring out how to. It's radically inexpensive material, but with this kind of significant deployment, we can see how much impact we can have on urban air quality to produce this much leaf area index. And it really does start to make JFK and these other barren landscapes ready for and eager to, we have a proposal to JFK to start flowering. It would be nice to be welcomed with flowers, right? But one of the big issues is that people don't know how to use flowers. So the intimacy of having them on your window or having them on your railing. The black pansies, for instance, I was talking about high perishability, which of course we're not familiar with in our food systems, which are designed for the reverse. The black pansies, unless you use them within a couple of minutes of picking them, they lose all their delicate volatiles, right? They're tasteless. So we flash infuse those into vodka to create black pansy vodka, which is delicious, I'm sure. But this exploration of what we can do with flowers and how we can kind of really incorporate them into our urban environment and into our lifestyles. Oh, and then for all the volunteers interested in that farming, it's much better to rappel while farming than to do it on your hands and knees, I promise. So, so the ag bags, we're just about to edition the ag bags for this season, but I'm interested in exploring this. But furthermore, the flowers, how we can explore flowers. I've been doing this in a number of ways. I've been doing these manufactories, which are a mashup between a manufacturing assembly line and a party. So using open source cola, which is a GNU licensed open source cola recipe developed by Kate Rich and Kel Brandon, who took 7 of the leaked recipes of Coca-Cola and made this open source version. So the cola manufactory is an assembly line where you walk along and you bubble your New York City water, then you put in pre-measured syringes of syrup, and you might put in stevia or the sugar of your choice, or not have to put in sugar. And then, of course, I add some, I've taken the known carcinogen, the 3 ml, and added some benign ingredients like New England aster flower tincture, which is the Iroquois used as a love potion, and it's a powerful antiviral, so that makes love cola. And then, of course, Happy Cola uses St. John's wort flowers and a tincture, which people bring in a lot of doses of those. Another flower product is the flower floss, and this, of course, stands for Free Libre Open Source Systems as opposed to Free Libre Open Source Software, that's actually not cotton candy, and it's not this sort of floss either, right? It's actually isomalt, which is the major ingredient in Metamucil. For those of you with sluggish gut, you know what I mean. It acts like a fiber in your lower gut, so you're fostering biodiversity in your lower gut, farming your lower gut. And it's optically clearer than sugar. It's about a half to 2/3 as Swedish sugar. Diabetics use it a lot. But what I do is use it as a like a cotton candy, but we sprinkle it with bee pollen and add these edible flowers, and then of course put this. We put this color-changing LED in the middle to have a taste of a kind of biodiverse future, right? The production and consumption of this good, this carnivalesque food, is the aggregate effect is not only to foster biodiversity in the lower gut, but also in your local urban environment, right? So that these good goods that I'm very interested in, where we can design, explore food and food systems that have this aggregated positive effect. So what happened with the manufacturers was actually a really interesting lesson that won't surprise you, but of course it did surprise me, is that people screwed them up, right? No matter how well I designed the assembly line, one step at a time. They didn't push down the syringe all the way. They kept spilling things. They got out of line. It was just a mess, right? And so I realized, of course, that a low-skilled assembly line work is not, of course, unskilled at all. It's highly skilled. And that I needed, to solve this problem, I needed some Oompa Loompas. So I formed a new musical theatre company called Child Labour. And so now I have children perform in musical but efficient assembly lines, and their puzzled parents and adoring community can purchase the goods that they see being produced by. So this is a current project where we're just rehearsing with 2 high school glee club musical theatre groups to produce. Of course, the colonomics works very well. Selling flavoured bubbling water is a good business to be in. It's no accident that there's some large companies profit from that. But in the case of the child labour musical theatre manufacturers, it's all open accounting. The children, of course, generate income for their educational resources. And did you have a question about? No. Okay. Please interrupt me for questions and clarifications at any moment. But this idea that the cola actually, we're developing a market for cola, as in the cola nut. We're trying to put the cola back in cola in a new flavour, which of course is the namesake for all these caffeinated, sweetened, bubbly drinks, but is also a nut that is the only forest agricultural product that the forest edge dwellers in West Africa can sell to economically protect their forests and clear cutting and other forms of monoculture. So we're hoping to scale the child labour coal manufactories so that we can develop a significant market for these colas, if you will, and a few other things. And this is a similar project that I've now turned to the children to help me with, which is based on a very simple solar chimney idea, where if you put plastic on a building, the air will heat up and that hot air will rise. If you put a filter on top of that, we can capture that black carbon, that ultrafine particulate pollution waste that, from combustion, diesel engines, vehicular, the stuff that changes the colour of snow, changes the reflectance of the atmosphere. It's a big coupling driver of this amorphous black carbon is something we can pull out of the air. So currently we've been using electrostatic precipitators, ESP. So the air moves up through these solar chimneys past the ESPs, the electrostatic precipitators. We collect that brine, same stuff you wipe off your windowsill, and then we bind it with some wax and clay and produce pencils, the length of which measures the amount of brine that we've passively and inexpensively pulled out of the air. And so that ultrafine particulate pollution is the largest by mass and volume and surface area of our pollution. It's ultra unregulated. It's small enough that it enters into our cardiovascular system. It's implicated in the breast cancer epidemic, the asthma epidemic, obesity epidemic, diabetes. It's the transport means for many contaminants in it because it's all surface area. These particles are so small. And of course, these ones didn't work so well, so we moved to ESPs, but I can demonstrate here that child labour was also used in the production of these. But again, this idea that we can take a invisible material that is something we share, something that is determining actually more than our genetic predisposition. The best predictor of your lifespan is now how close you live to a major arterial road, as your genetic predictors. The idea that we can explore and start to get a handle on this material, this black carbon that is, and who can do it? I mean, who's doing these small-scale experiments to figure out what works, what doesn't? The OOZE project, I'd like to turn to quickly to bring in the non-humans and the attention to non-humans as actually a really important way to explore how we can reimagine our relationship to natural systems. Of course, food is one interface, but our interactions with animals is another way. I like this interesting biostatistician from the University of Alabama who looked at, David Allison, he looked at 38 species of non-humans that live in close proximity to humans, from lab rats to pets to feral coyotes and wildcats, to see how many of them also demonstrated the obesity epidemic. And you can probably guess how many of those 38 species showed evidence of the obesity epidemic. All of them, yeah. So it's not about whether or not you're getting to the gym, right? The environment is implicated, and the animals are very explicit, being able to demonstrate this commonality, this environmental commons that we share. So this is a communication technologies I developed for birds that are perches. So a bird comes along and sits on the perch, the handy perch, and it'll then trigger a sound file that will say something like this.
Now here's what you need to do. Go down there and buy some of those health food bars, the ones you call bird food, and bring it here and scatter it around. There's a good person.
So I've set these up in a number of different places, and I set 4 or 5 or 6. In this case, in the Whitney Museum and the Sculpture Court, we had 6 of these perches that were set up where the birds could jump on each one of them, each with a different argument, to see which best elicited cooperative behavior from the people below. And birds were kind of experimenting on people, if you will. And my favourite was the one that argued for copyright dues for all the melodic resources that have been borrowed for cell phone ringtones. But the birds, actually, their favourite was this one, this perch, and this argument. Actually, about 8 to 1, the birds preferred this argument.
Tick, tick, tick. That's the sound of genetic mutations. of the avian flu becoming a deadly human flu. Do you know what slows it down? Healthy subpopulations of birds, increasing biodiversity generally. It is in your interests that I am healthy, happy, well-fed. Hence, you could share some of your nutritional resources instead of monopolizing them. That is, share your lunch.
So Biology 101 from the pigeons. There's a whole series of these nutrition facts that this idea that they taught us, that swine flu and avian flu has taught us that our industrialized food production facilities have become cauldrons of pathogenicity, right, where we put many genetically similar organisms in stress conditions without UV light to sterilize. In a natural context, if a virus is too pathogenic, it will kill the animal too quickly and it won't pass on. So it has natural limits. But in our context, we've created these cauldrons of pathogenicity, and we can, of course, recreate them, change them, looking at how non-humans organize their territorial resources is a good clue to that. So one of the things that defines urban biodiversity, and 2010 was the year of biodiversity, and UNEP did a big citizen science study that the biggest one done a huge coordination effort to look at the pollinators in metropolitan Paris and to compare that to the surrounding rural area. And you probably know that both the species number and the species count were higher in metropolitan Paris than they were in the surrounding rural agricultural area. And that tells us a lot about the value of cities as islands of biodiversity and how they're characterized as these patches of viable ecologies that are disconnected by obstacles. And I think we can stitch these things together to make more viable habitat. And the butterfly bridge is one experiment in doing this, where it's quite simply a butterfly bridge where it's a bridge planted with butterfly attracting plants. So instead of being smeared on your windscreen, like the organisms from one patch ecology can travel to another patch of viable habitat, and the genetic flow between. It's nice seeing these burly men carrying these lovely flowers, isn't it? Of course, the genetic flow between these two isolated populations increases the resilience of both of those populations. So, and the fleeting presence of those valuable pollinators is made more durable, more visible by the bridge itself. So this, we were actually getting 30 butterflies per hour in that bridge that we had in Washington, D.C. And similarly, the Salamander Superhighway is a facilitates safe passage for these critical organisms that being from Australia actually, salamanders are like Santa's elves. They just don't exist, right? They're impossible climatically. And here, in this verdant northeast area, the entire ecosystem is dependent on them. And apparently everybody loves to eat salamander. All cross-species taste tests say that salamander is delicious, and hence they've developed a monopoly on the technology of limb regeneration. So you can pull off a tail, and they'll grow back a perfectly good new one, which I think is a very interesting pointer to, that's like milking a cow, right? You're not sacrificing the organism. You get this flesh, but of course all of that energy transfer. Oh, I think it's actually important to, shocking to me that if you rolled a ball of biomass of all the vertebrate mammals, all things long and hairy, all the deer and squirrels and mice and coyotes into a big ball, that biomass would be half the size of the salamanders and frogs and amphibians and their healthy young, right? A huge amount of flesh hidden in puddles and under leaf matter, and of course the entire ecosystem depends on. But this idea that you could think it's an interesting contrast to Google's Goo, right? The $320,000 burger, the so-called ethical meat, where we can go over about salamander tails, but this is actually to prevent them from being smeared like cream cheese on roads. Right about now, as all the spring peepers and frogs and salamanders are migrating. Of course, they're migratory animals. They are damned if they do, they are damned if they don't. It only takes, I think it was 10 cars per hour to ensure a 75% kill rate on roads that is safe. Anyway, this is a salamander superhighway that the salamanders can enter. When they enter, actually, there is a PIR sensor. So as the salamander is going through, they can tweet, "Hi honey, I'm coming home." This was set up in the Socrates Sculpture Park, so the Socratic salamander tweeted important questions like, what comes first, the salamander or the migration route? Of course, the idea that these, if you have a very sensitive, skin, touchscreen skin that you can breathe through, the temperature differences between the black impervious surface and the white are quite legible, right? So the bet is on how quickly the salamanders will learn to read the on-ramp signs, and then be able to transfer that experience to other sites where the cross-species signage is quite clear. This is another collaboration with non-humans in the form of the biochar barbecue. Biochar, you may be familiar with, is the byproduct of a waste-to-energy process that is extraordinarily interesting to particularly people like me from Australia or in these very carbon-depleted, poor soil areas where biochar has really demonstrated how much it can augment soil. But it's a byproduct of a waste-to-energy process, and it's very interesting because it sequesters carbon conservatively for about 5,000 years, working into the ground. It's an archaeological technology used by civilizations in the Amazon to create Loma Prieta, the most fertile soil we know. It's a process, pyrolysis, where you take cellulosic waste and incinerate it, where it doesn't produce particulates, it produces methane-like gas, syngas that you can then use for a barbecue. So this is where it was worked into the area in the Socrates Sculpture Park, which is a former landfill. You can see what we got was a 40% increase in growth, and we got about 15 more species in the area that had been augmented with biochar than hadn't. And again, this is a small-scale public experiment where people can walk past and say, oh, that works, right? They can start to grab this idea that with biochar, you're sequestering carbon for 5,000 years, let's say, and for, with forest, that's 200, 300 years, and we need to be thinking in a 5,000 year time frame when it comes to sequestering carbon. So what we do, actually, talking to people about waste-to-energy processes, although post-supersonic Sandy and these the need, urgency to popularize how we use waste as energy and what distributed small-scale energy production looks like, still is very hard work. So what I do with this is I invite people to bring their junk mail, their old dissertations and papers, and we incinerate them on the biochar on the stove, the pyrolysis stove, and have a barbecue. And then I also invite a salsa DJ so we can have a biochar-cha and really discuss what it takes to pick up this cellulosic waste material, this junk mail, and where it goes. Because in Long Island City, there's 5 subcontractors involved. First of all, of course, the diesel trucks that compromise our cardiovascular health in the first place, picking up this so-called beautifully recycled paper, but then to 5 other subcontractors. Some of it ends up in Pennsylvania, some in landfills, some. It just doesn't make any sense to distribute waste, right? And to pollute the air doing it. And so, it's a kind of convivial context in which we can start to talk about how this can augment the soil, increase the biodiversity, and we calculated that with just the junk mail, business correspondence mail, we could power all the lighting in Long Island City just from diverting that waste, right? So these kinds of experiments that are material, small scale, and directly using the material, people could take home their own biochar and repeat the experiment in part of their yard or in one container of roses and not the other to see the effects they could have, right? These small scale material demonstrations, what I call these public experiments, I think are an important methodology to raise standards of evidence and change who can have an opinion about what waste to energy processes look like, what our future energy systems will be. Similarly, moth cinema is an exploration of urban lighting. Does anybody here not know that moths are attracted to lights? We know that, right? It's so well known, and yet we don't design our urban streetscapes or urban lighting as if that's the case. In the case of the moth cinema, it's a silver screen that hangs in a park. It's illuminated by light, and after dark, according to a screening schedule with some celebrities there. But instead of being fried and bedazzled by the light that's illuminating the silver screen, the moths actually find a moth garden full of nectar plants and host plants. And so they dance around, they play out their nightly dramas, their love triangles and their adventures, casting these dramatic shadows on the screen behind them, and displaying in real time the success that we have had in catering to and supporting these critical pollinators. And it begs the question of why and how we could design with companion planting urban lighting to celebrate the presence of these creatures of the night that provide such valuable pollinating services. This was the first moon and moth seen in New York City in 40 years. That was at Socrates Sculpture Park at the Moth Cinema. And in these small interventions, I would argue, can have significant effect or point to the possibility of that. And I would like to ask why we can't have moth cinemas at every park to display how well we are catering to these non-humans and accommodating. So another way to look at these places that we call, these common spaces we call parks, is actually through the lens of sports, because sports are actually one of the only ways that these new green spaces, or so-called green spaces, are created, and they do choreograph our movement in and use of many of these green spaces. And so rethinking what sports could do, so the insanity of sports that increase our health but degrade environmental health, like the toxic turf used on most sports playing fields, has meant I've been looking at how and if we can do this. So one of the sports that I developed is based on I struggle with this animal, the strongest animal in the world. Does anybody know who that is? Ant. Most people think the ants, and I don't know who the PR company is for the ants, but it's not. It's not the ants. Yes, no. So they can lift about 17 times their weight, but it's the Rhinoceros Beetle or the Stag Beetle that can lift about 36 times their weight. They're like biomechanically impossible. There's no explanation for why they are so strong or how they are so strong, but they're like the caterpillar of the underworld, right? Or the yellow heavy lifting equipment, right? They lift up the old logs and they aerate the rhizomic soil area and really increase soil biodiversity, and they appear in every biome. But they're very difficult to relate to, and most of us don't understand how to do it. So I spent some time trying to think about how we could interface to them, and we developed Chris Woken, a new sport called Rhinoceros Beetle Wrestling, where I challenge these icons of masculinity to man versus beast, and put on the head-mounted display. And this scales human forces to beetle scale, and beetle forces to human scale, so it's a level playing field. And then, of course, I take wages on the outcome, which is my fundraising strategy. Of course, optically, the head-mounted display also amplifies the size of the rhinoceros beetle. And I actually offer a scholarship to rhinoceros beetle wrestling champions to my program at NYU. Because I'd like to see it as a varsity sport. Because you can imagine that as a varsity sport, right, this would, you need to have rhinoceros beetles around, right? And those rhinoceros beetles need to be happy and raunchy before the fight, right? And you know, a few of them can get out and start churning up that toxic turf we call sports fields and really aerating it and returning some soil biodiversity. So that's one example of a sport that could have a significant impact. Another set of projects that I've been doing is these training programs that, again, very explicitly are about exercises that improve human health, but also environmental health simultaneously. Right. So this is one of the programs that we designed for individuals and small groups to do weekly, and each exercise has a significant environmental effect in addition to the human health effect. And the popular exercise, the most popular was this hula hooping, I think because people like that six-pack, and the best exercise for core body conditioning is hula hooping. And in the case of the clinic's training program, our hula hoops are adapted so that we actually have New England wildflower seeds in them. So as you hula hoop, you are spreading perennial resources for these valuable pollinators. And of course, you're much more likely to go back next Saturday and see, do your routine and see the effect you've had, and see whether the birds have worked out, oh, here's that person again with the yellow hula hoop, here's a free lunch, or has something sprouted, right? That your observations about your impact on the local urban environment is as compelling as the desire for the six-pack itself, right? So this is the tree office that was mentioned, also part of the ooze menu. This isn't just an office and a tree, of course, with high-speed internet and locally generated power. It was my office. I use it for clinic meetings as a field office, but when I wasn't using it, which was really, it was a co-working space for people to finish off their dissertations or screenplays, or just to work in really the best office in New York City, in my humble opinion. But the idea of this tree office was that we could actually, there was floodability, that we could define a space without enclosing it, right? So that we maintain the kind of transparency of how natural systems work. But the main conceit of it is that it was owned and operated by the tree. So the tree is actually the landlord. And of course this is based on the idea that of this tree, which is, I looked up, Milwaukee is the German Athens, which seems like an oxymoron. But this tree is actually in Athens, Georgia, I think auspiciously, which is the tree that owns itself. Has anybody visited it? No, tree? It was, it's a tourist attraction, but it was deeded to itself by Colonel William Jackson in 1832. Interesting time to be thinking about who owns itself and who can own themselves. Unfortunately, that tree died, and so the Junior Ladies Gardening Club came along in 1946 and planted a scion of that tree, the acorn of that tree, back in the same 8 foot by 8 foot area that had been deeded to the tree, and therefore testing heritability laws. And I think it instantiating a very important legal precedence that provides a sharp contrast to the paradigm of environmental services that is the kind of dominant paradigm we use to value nature in contemporary Anthropocenic times where the value of a street tree in New York City, for example, is $400 for all the carbon sequestering and stormwater retention, habitat provisioning, shade and energy savings, and particulate capture, all the things that trees serve us for beautification. Right? The value of a street tree in New York City for 80 years of service is $400. Which is not consistent with my idea of value, and in fact, the tree that owns this tree earned $400 in a month from the hot desking co-working fees, right? 20 people paying $25 membership each. What does the tree do with all that profit? Of course, it augments the soil around it with biochar. It does some companion planting, and it sent 3 of its saplings off to college. One went to Cornell, one went to Rutgers, and one went to NYU and failed and didn't do very well. But of course, this idea that the tree, of course, can act in its own interest, and that this translation of of the Bolivian Rights of Earth document, which is in this Rights of Mother Earth, it's in this very native language, but here instantiated in a very kind of familiar, that we can extend rights discourse to non-humans, of course, and it might seem absurd, but somehow getting a text from your landlord who's a tree made as much sense to me as my other landlords, in fact. So I like the idea. A landlord is a tree. That works for me. And so anyone who's interested, we've kitified the tree office kit, and the tree itself is an executive in the Ooze Corporation, because we've incorporated Ooze as a B corporation, extending the personhood of corporations to the trees and non-humans in Ooze. And of course, this idea that we can treat trees as assets and facilities for touring, social climbing, and other rich, diverse activities is, I think, a powerful alternative to this, service worker, very low-paid service worker approach that has been mainstreamed. This is a very new project called Life Cycle that is really in response to the metastasizing cancer of city bike programs. They're fine. It costs $8,000 a bike for cities to install. Can you believe that? And that's not including the trucks that then truck them around to balance out the load, right? Most of that money, of course, is spent on the medieval walking technology that is microcharging you to ride it. And it just makes no sense, right? Cities, it's in cities' interest that we ride bikes, right? They should be paying us to ride bikes for all the infrastructure savings and for cardiovascular health improvements, reduced hospitalization, reduced load on public transportation. They should be paying us to ride. The cities aren't, but I've been exploring as the environmental health clinic how we might pay people to ride using this life cycle project. So at the moment, actually, this is the other thing behind this game. As was mentioned, I actually did do a degree in biology and biochem and neuroscience PhD, and I didn't learn this, right? I learned a lot about evolution theory, and I learned about selective pressure, and of course we know that Darwin never said survival of the fittest, although Harvard Business Review seems to say it in every issue. Nonetheless, I did not know, with all of my biological education, that most of the world's biomass is composed of mutualists, that class of symbiotes that are mutualistic. Right? All the forests, meadows, and corals, it's all mutualism, right? I didn't know that. I don't think that's very in the popular imagination. And how selection occurs is, I think, radically misrepresented. So, and there's a game that I've developed to look at how we can interrelate these little known urban bugs that we depend on. But essentially what we're doing is we're promoting non-humans by putting these unknown urban organisms on bikes. And that many of them have their own political agenda to stand for. But this idea that we can promote and increase the visibility of these non-human organisms is what we're doing. So that every time Tim, this is one of my students, is locking up his bike or unlocking his bike, someone's going to ask him, what have you got on your bike? And he'll say, oh, that's Daphnia. It's in every freshwater system in the world. It's the most widespread freshwater organism. It's incredibly sensitive to zinc, and you can watch it walk like, he can, talk about this kind of radical pedagogy of figuring out, oh, I think I've seen one of those, where we're sharing experiences and interleaving this into the popular imagination. And of course, putting them on the streets where, a bus stop ad is $60,000 for 3 weeks in New York City, which is of course why we see Verizon ads there, corporate ads. But this idea that if you're an experimental theatre group promoting a show or a lecture series at a university, you could pay the environmental health clinic $100 for 3 months of advertising on a bike that's proximal to your area. I cross-dress the bike for about $20 for the really nice Tyvek print that's durable. And then, of course, the rest goes to the cyclist, right? So that we can actually, of course, building an explicit economic model. A cyclist is not a bus stop ad, right? They're only going to put on their cycle something they care about. So it's not really bike advertising, it's bike advocating. So non-profits and small rock music festivals or indie record stores or something like that, sorts of things that would be promoted. And when you compare that to 2 lines in Village Voice, which is $400 for 3 days, and then it gets seen, right? It's a different project. Anyway, so this is the life cycle project we're just piloting, and I'm going to skip through some of these other bike things. But the bikes as icons of independent mobility, right? What's most offensive about the city bike programs is that they become conduits for the corporate monoculture and advertising that, and in this case where we've got opportunities, this is what I call occupies, which is a point of view, a persistence of vision display that we put on wheels that uses, this is still prototyped, but we use the geolocation so that as you're riding a bike, you're not only increasing your visibility with these lovely flashy lights, but as you go through an intersection, for instance, you are displaying fatalities at that intersection, right? Or along the bike path in the river, you're showing the seahorses that live in the water that are unseen. So this idea that bikes are a conduit for producing kind of diverse, instantiated diverse. Yeah.
So we can give people have comments.
Yes, okay. I'm going to skip through. That's like choosing between babies. Hang on. Okay, I'm going to skip through the one beach project and finish off with some waterfront projects. The Mussel Choir is a project that's currently working on in East River waterfront that's going using these heroic organisms, blue mussels. And I think that the oysters have the same PR firm that the ants have, because most of you have heard of oyster texture, but it's blue mussels that filter 4 times as much water per organism, and they form these pliant megametropolises that, and the heavy lifters of water quality. I'm taking the only 15 feet of reconstructed shoreline in all of Manhattan Island, populating them with mussels, and then putting on the mussels some sensors, that is a Hall effect sensor that tells us when the mussels open and close. So we know when they're, of course that tells us a lot about their water quality because their behavior reflects their water quality. So I take that data and I turn that into song, hence the mussel choir. And this is a prototype that we installed in the famous biennial of the mussel choir. And the first question is, of course, what does a mussel choir sing? And it sings a version of this song, which you know is the first computer-synthesized voice and has become the icon of AI, this artificial intelligence, this idea that we can model the irreducible complexity of our socio-ecological systems in computational models. And it's been popularized in HAL and a few other, HAL and 2001, right? And Siri, if you ask Siri to sing you a song. This is a version, done by that's Aaron Coblin's version to iconify distributed intelligence. This is 2,000 people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, each singing and having it assembled into a song, which I think is a very cynical representation of the technological opportunity of distributed intelligence. But and so because of that, the Mussel Choir, their first hit single, which is yet to hit, is actually a bicycle not built for two, or a bicycle built for 2,000, which is what Aaron's piece called, but a bicycle built for too many, which here's a version of this idea that that we could instantiate not artificial intelligence, not this distributed intelligence, but something more like natural intelligence, where we're drawing on the actual responses of these biological and intelligent organisms that their response to water quality is, I would argue, much more meaningful than the pH to beta D DO battery of public data that we normally have. Similarly, the amphibious architecture array is a series of buoys that floats in the East River, and they light up and fish from underneath as a low-resolution display of fish presence. You can see here they were deployed in the East River, and with a top light, which is always on, that's warm red colour when dissolved oxygen is low, that shifts to a cool blue-green colour when dissolved oxygen is high. And of course the first question that people ask when they see this is, are there fish in the East River? So yes, there are fish in the East River. And the idea of this project is really to change the view of the river from a pretty reflective surface into a view of a teeming habitat, the appreciation of that. So you can also text the fish, and the fish will text you back. But more importantly, there's a lure that I developed. So instead of feeding them Doritos or cigarette butts or there's always a sign where there's urban animals, do not feed the animals. Right? So you've got to ask, why not feed the animals? Why should we monopolize nutritional resources? So in this case, the lure is a nutritionally appropriate fish food, cross-species food, that is based on an algae derivative called gellan and has gin and grapefruit juice in it, but also a chelating agent, so that as the fish ingest it, it binds to the bioaccumulated heavy metals, the PCBs, right, and complexes into a less reactive form where it passes out and is effectively removed from bioavailability, right? So this idea, like targeted drug delivery, instead of dredging the Hudson, which they're doing after 30 years of legal and legislative wrangling, where GE, unfortunately, they're still around, so they're held responsible for all the pollutants in the largest Superfund site in the country, but they're resuspending that toxic sludge, and they're putting it on barges and shipping it off to Pennsylvania or the nearest third world country, right? So where it continues to be toxic sludge, right? So this idea that we can displace our environmental issues is insane, right? And instead, in this case, we are treating them in situ, and by treating the fish's health, where it's actually bioaccumulated inexpensively, we are treating our own health. The most direct source of mercury in our bodies is from our fish. So this interrelationship is very explicit and clear. This has led to a cross-species adventure club, which I'm going to skip over, but just to tell you that there are many food explorations, tongue-first explorations into food that actually does. Food and food systems that the aggregate effect is to increase biodiversity. Here's the salamander cocktails that I was alluding to before. Murkish Delight. I'll just show you. I'm going to skip over the kissing frogs, but just show you this nano water buffalo ice cream is one example where we take we make the most delicious ice cream from water buffalo milk because it's high fat, high protein, as the Romans discovered, hence your buffalo ricotta and buffalo mozzarella, right? It makes the best ice cream, nano-sized crystals, luxuriant creaminess. This creates the demand, of course, for water buffalo milk, which creates the demand for water buffalo, which, of course, demand wetlands. And wetlands are, the ecosystem that sequesters more carbon than any other ecosystem. When used in combination with conventional dairy, they capture all the terrestrial runoff from the spray fields where the manure is sprayed on to fertilize, right? But every rain event runs into the aquatic ecosystem. They capture that. They can recharge aquifers. And of course, the water buffalo can extend and construct and rebuild their own wetlands. So we're protecting the aquatic ecosystem and the terrestrial ecosystem, the nitrification. The farmers are producing a luxury product and greatly increasing their environmental performance simultaneously. So these foods and food systems, I would argue, can aggregate into something. Two more projects that are important for me to show you because I need your feedback on them. The phenological clock is a new one that I have just launched just to whet your appetite for future drinks. I'll show you the glassy or cocktails, but I won't talk about them. The phenological clock, you can see on here on the cross-species table, where we set a CEDA table for non-humans, is actually this January through December marking. These are the species in the park with flowering perennials, insects, birds, and trees when they bud, when they migrate, when they flower or leaf out. So the idea of this is that we can start to change our representation of time, giving a fingerprint of a local ecosystem, where instead of pretending that time is empty and nowhere and everywhere the same, we can turn our attention to the seasonal interdependence of these organisms, right? The temporal structure of phenology, of course, is our most sensitive indicator of climate destabilization, and how these organisms relate to each other and is, I think, a critical way to iconify a new understanding of time that is not abstracted. So I'm going to finish with one exploration of wetlands, which I would say, just to quote the graduate, I have one word for you, one word. It's not plastics, it's actually wetlands, which I would argue are the technology of the 21st century. And this is the Sit Different campaign, which I'll just, you know the reference, don't you? Yes. Anyway. This idea that we can, finish those dissertations by watching the dragonflies rather than sitting in Starbucks on the head's way down display in these bird studies. And explore a different way. These are the tadpole high rises. I'm just going to, again, eel speed bumps, run past them to show you that we can integrate wetlands into our urban infrastructure as these wet landings, where we can explore how what a wet landing looks like, what a new infrastructure is like, to kind of reclaim the wonder of flight using biomimetic wings to explore the angle of attack and the maneuverability, and why do seabirds have pointed wings and birds of prey have shovel-like wings. And of course, strap on these 16-foot wingspan wings and practice your own wet landings in, as we did here in a constructed wetland in San Jose. Or here in Toronto, where we flew hundreds of people across downtown, across Nathan Phillips Square, past City Hall, through downtown Toronto, to explore what fast, radically inexpensive, and emissionless urban mobility might look like. There was lots of flying happening. Anyway, this was a flight school that you had to go through your autopilot license. Grandmothers were the most enthusiastic flyers. They lined up over and over. They lined up first and longest. And this idea that we could explore, radically get beyond the bike lane, right? What I would call that is a shared public memory, a spectacle, but a shared public memory of a possible future. But once you've actually flown on these zip lines, it becomes much more feasible to start to think about what it's like to more radically reimagine what our urban infrastructure looks like. And elevators provide the basis for that. It's a project called the Raised Elevator that extends the elevator shaft 30% higher than the building, right, to produce the view. You go for a ride. We know that elevators are now destinations, not just a route from A to B. But by putting a glass box on a building, it heats up. That can vent out to access the oldest technology of architecture, the shaft effect. And with new fire code engineering, that means we can isolate the shaft in the event of fire, but the rest of the time, we can actually, with a 30% head, replace the HVAC system. And so that becomes meaningful when you have these next-gen elevators where the increased free fall means that we can tip the balance, right? The regenerative braking, we tip the balance where the elevator becomes a micro power plant for that building, right? We've replaced the HVAC, which 60 to 80% are some estimates of carbon is building related, and most of that is HVAC. And of course we produce, this is actually a case study for Tomcat Bakery, which has 76 trucks every morning producing, delivering fresh artisanal bread all over New York City, right? And 76 trucks worth of diesel fumes into the lungs of the Long Island City residents. That's actually the largest housing project in the country. Why do we distribute our food in such a way that it gives our kids asthma and degrades our environmental health? Right? This is not a joke. For less than the cost of one truck, for one truck's maintenance for 1 year, Tomcat Bakery can put a zip line down to the river where it can distribute with higher throughput, higher reliability, their goods much more effectively, much more inexpensively, and of course access the water-based transportation that is the raison d'etre for most of our cities on water to distribute them effectively. So I'd like to close by saying our capacity, I'm going to skip over this project and I'll leave it here actually. Our capacity to explore and redesign our relationship to natural systems, I would argue, requires what the environmental health clinic licenses is for each of us to reimagine how we eat and what we do. Not in sort of the, turn off the light bulbs, use less gas, insulate your house better, or, I've had 3 students come to me and say this, I'm an environmentalist, I ride my bike and I don't eat meat and I print on both sides of the paper, but wouldn't the best thing for me to do be to suicide? Because then I'll have an even smaller carbon footprint, right? This whole, the legacy environmentalism of do not touch, leave no trace, is that conservation, that preservation, not the radical reimagination or the do something and make it good. claiming agency and the capacity to explore how we might redesign a desirable, a delicious, and a tasty biodiverse future. Thank you. I would love some questions. Yes.
David, I'm gonna start by saying I support we should do every one of these projects as small or large. And the emphasis on the relation to however we
This is the but, right? This is
yeah,
the but.
no, this is more like an and it seems to me when we do these things, what we discover is in some ways the answer to the question is, why are we doing this? Why are we spending so much money? And like A, the incineration, B, the bicycle, and C, interestingly, the muscle, which is in some ways simple. That is, when it came to incineration, we would be putting out of business an entire apparatus of capital. And we can't even simply say it's capitalist, it's all those laborers whose jobs depend on what you're exactly right about, which is the in some ways, absolutely nonsensible distribution of refuse. We can think about why didn't we have rails to JFK for so long? Well, because the taxi cab. So, and in putting the flower bats up, putting the mussels in the eBay, you did, and you must have run into all the regulations that make that a prohibited practice except under the label of art. So the and question is, how do these things help us understand the actual arrangements of the capitalism that allow for certain scale, but perhaps help answer the question, like, well, this makes sense why we need to do this. It's bad sense. So I'm wondering how in doing this you are coming to understand the arrangements of the world that prohibit this scheme. Now, but I do mean that just not in a bad capitalists, but all those people's jobs. At the same time, I say, yes, you need to do this.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I started off by saying the kind of institutionalization of these little tiny projects that look particularly like the amphibious architecture array. They look cute little, oh, that's a nice little exception, right? And it's interesting to have gone through the amphibious architecture array design, where, of course, the ocean and coastal engineers who have designed the anchoring system for it. I drew up an anchoring system that has helical anchors and uses tension and buoyancy, and it's about $6,000 to anchor this. The city authorized ocean and coastal engineering firm drew up a $260,000 anchoring system, which of course they are an engineering firm and 20% of their budget is the fee, and they have no incentive to design or sign off on $6,000 systems. Or actually, in this case, this is the Far Rockaway Beach, where the Army Corps of Engineers has put in tons of sand to rebuild the beach and put the boardwalk exactly back where it was, reloading the gun, like the rigid surface of the boardwalk comes up in storm surge. Slams around and damages property and can kill people, but it's gone back where it was. And I don't know, is there an alternative? So the project that I'm just about to launch uses this material developed by Lord of the Rings, which is it's a chainmail that we're putting in here on the boardwalk, a small section of it, because we can plant the dune grasses and the skippers and the organisms that pull the nutrients out of the sand that's being put up there. And what I discovered by working on this sandcastle competition is that the sand that's being trucked in from Pennsylvania is full of nutrients, and a shocked ecosystem is now being shocked again with big algae blooms from the nutrients leaching from that beach sand that's the fixed beach, right? That it's not, I would argue, because there is an alternatives, right? By staging, this is the experiment in exactly this that I'm talking about. By staging, we're putting in a small section of this material, right? So the locals can come along and see, oh, there's the dune grasses that are stabilizing the beach and putting the nutrients out. Oh, and when the storm surge comes along, it'll go straight through, right? And it's actually the locals and their skepticism that no amount of evidence, no amount of science, no amount of doing what I call these $1 million photoshops that they but the political organization of these skeptical locals making demands on their community group, making demands on the mayor, showing the dead fish, is, I would argue, the only political force that I can see work in the face of these large forces. And it's material, it's evidence-driven, it coordinates many diverse ideas because it's a small-scale material. And irreducible complexity, it's compelling representations that can appeal to significant, small groups with significant voices. I would argue it's the only way we can institutionalize further change, to make demands for putting, having the Army Corps of Engineers rip back up the boardwalk and do something that's much more feasible. And it's not that, we could say that these forces are against us, but the biochar, we've got a chapter opening in Toronto, actually in a couple of weeks, in Brooklyn Navy Yards. These are small-scale initiatives that can build jobs, that can build community investment, that are hyper-local accountability, that are evidence-driven, that, I don't know, it's the best strategy I have. And yeah, but it's not an easy answer. Yeah. All right.
I was wondering if any of these things that you're talking about, that you're and they do have a good result at design competitions, so if you're going in New York stuff. And then my other question is, with biochar, if you're burning junk mail, newspapers, and all that,
Sorry?
So with the biochar,
Yeah.
I know normally you use bones, like brush or whatever, but using junk mail and presentation and all that, are you just making more possible? I'm just curious, can you grow food in it?
I mean, that's the question to ask, right? And that's the important question that we need to ask. And I would argue that there's only one commercially produced biochar product on the East Coast that Incendia produce, and they are very careful to use, sustainably forested offcuts, right, and clean fodder, right, clean. But who the hell is working out where that cadmium stuff goes? All the inks. Who's working that out? And actually incinerating them at a very high temperature, and then immobilizing them in the heavy metals in these urban soils. I would argue is a better way to deal with the soup of industrial contaminants. We don't have the research on them. We don't know what to do. So it's not about getting the pristine organic. It's not that this stuff is good and the rest of the stuff is bad. It's how do we deal with the real urban waste streams that do have, you know, all these heavy metals and inks in them. And from my understanding, it's pyrolysis that's the best way to do it. And working into the soil locally seems to have been very successful. So in that, I'll just answer the first question about the rebuild by design, which is the more traditional urban planning. So 10 architecture teams have gotten together to produce these master plans for 200 miles of coastline of what it should look like post Superstorm Sandy, and sort of try and grab some of that federal money that's coming in to do something. And they're great people on these teams. They're all really interesting. They each got $1 million to do their plans. That's why I call them the $1 million Photoshops. Because in the next stage, I think, will be $30 million 3D models. You know, this idea that we don't learn a thing from doing a pretty image with bike paths along the waterfront. We don't know if mussels grow here, if they'll grow 15 feet further, right? With the irreducible complexity of socio-ecological systems, we need to experiment. And we need to draw on the diverse experiences and very specific local experiments. They could have spent 1/10 of, each of those teams could have spent 1/10 of, and that would have funded 15 of these projects, right? But there isn't a paradigm of evidence-driven, publicly legible, public experimentation. That doesn't work and that hasn't been supported as a methodology in redesigning and reimagining our shared urban infrastructure. And I would argue that's the very opportunity that we have. It doesn't take a lot of resources, and it does engage diverse people and incredibly diverse ways of knowing in playful, you know, the work of, this is an opportunity, the Anthropocene, the climate crisis, the superstorm surges, these are opportunities to make things better, right? Not to share horror stories, but to figure out how we might, to grab that agency, to grab our opportunity to build the society that we want. And so I think that's the hands-on, muddy way that we have available to us. I'd like to